Welcome to Cut to the Chase, where we talk about compelling legal, regulatory, and public interest information and news. Your host is Greg Goldfarb, an attorney, entrepreneur, investor, and activist.
All right, folks, it's time for our favorite podcast, Cut to the Chase. We're on part 2 of our discussion about anti-Semitism with Brian Siegal, Regional Director of American Jewish Committee. Part 1 was about the history of anti-Semitism, what it is, what's going on. Now we're going to start to talk about what the AJC and Brian are doing to combat it and what you can do to help combat it as well. All right, so we've talked about the depth of this problem, and I don't think we've really even talked that comprehensively about how bad of a problem this is. And I do want to say this, even though we're focusing on anti-Semitism and a lot of this is sort of being just, blowing up after October 7th, there have been acts of probably a lot of anti-Muslim acts and racism. I'm sure that a lot of the people that are anti-Semitic are also racist, anti-Muslim. You have the far right, it's going on, both sides, both extreme sides. So I don't want to downplay that. But, we're talking about anti-Semitism today and what Brian does and what the AJC does to combat it. So I want to shift gears a little bit right now and talk about the report that was issued by the AJC, and which sort of piqued my, I said, oh my God, I saw in the Wall Street Journal that there was reference to the State of Anti-Semitism in America report by the AJC. And I, again, felt like a fool, how could I not know about this? But let's talk about that report. Is it an annual report? What is the report about? Let's get into the why it's done and all that.
Yeah, well, thank you, Greg. There's, there are a lot of good data out there about the instances of hate crimes and anti-Semitic incidents. The FBI puts out a hate crimes report, and it unfortunately in the last iteration showed a huge jump in bias crimes aimed at Jews, who accounted for 60% of all religiously motivated hate crimes. And again, a community of less than 2% of the overall population. But what we realized as an organization several years ago was that there's the instances of hate itself, and then there's also how it's perceived by both the Jewish community and the impact that it's having on the Jewish community and on the society at large. Because as we always point out, anti-Semitism affects Jews directly, but it also tangibly impacts society as a whole. And you know that when you see anti-Semitism in a society, it really is tearing at the fabric of a democracy. So we felt that it was important to really illustrate how the Jewish community is perceiving anti-Semitism and its rise, and how it's being perceived by the larger society. And so we started conducting this report. This is the 5th annual report that we've conducted. And so this is AJC's State of Anti-Semitism in America report for 2023. And it was conducted by a research company, SSRS, based on interviews conducted by telephone and online from October 5th to November 21 of 2023. So many of the interviews conducted after October 7th, as you pointed out, which is significant. And so, essentially the findings, I'll give you a couple of the key findings from this report. 63% of American Jews say that the status of Jews in the US is less secure compared to 1 year ago. And in 2022, when asked that same question, the number was 41%. So in this last, 2023, from this time we conducted this report, that number jumped, by 22%. So 63% of American Jews say they feel less secure in America than they did even a year ago. 78% of American Jews who heard about the Hamas terrorist attack in Israel say the attacks made them feel less safe as a Jewish person in the US. And 46% of American Jews say they altered their behavior out of fear of anti-Semitism. So that could mean taking off a kippah if they normally wear one, or if they wear a Jewish star, a Magen David, tucking it into the shirt because they're afraid that they might be physically or verbally harassed. So, and that's just one area. There's also, really striking facts, data that came out about anti-Semitism on college campuses. And you referenced the college campus, which we've really seen become a kind of focal point of growing anti-Semitism and putting many in the Jewish community in fear. 24% of current or recent college students say they felt uncomfortable or unsafe at a campus event because of their Jewish identity. And 1 in 4 current or recent college students say they've avoided wearing, carrying, or displaying things that would identify them as Jewish out of fear of anti-Semitism. So that just gives you, just a sense of how people are feeling. There was also a statistic about campus that said that 1 in 5 Jewish students reported feeling excluded from a group or event on campus because of their Jewish identity. So it's really not a positive statement, and it just is an indication that we have a lot of work to do.
All right, so let's talk about what's going on with campuses, and it's not all the campuses. There's not the problems that we're going to talk about are not taking place at all the campuses. But what are the typical problems, and why does it seem to be only at the elite universities? I mean, I don't really see this happening just, at some regular, ordinary college.
Well, I'll say a couple of things, and you talked about October 7th and sort of, what transpired in terms of the, deadliest attack against the Jewish community. Hamas as a terrorist organization killed over 1,200 Jews, the deadliest attack on Jews since the Holocaust. So anti-Semitism, it's a long-standing serious threat in the US, but it has really only increased since October 7th. There was almost this double trauma within the Jewish community. One, witnessing what happened to our brothers and sisters, in Israel, and then a second trauma to see how many in the US, dealt with this, some praising Hamas, and even in other circumstances, instead of compassion for the Jewish community, really, blaming the Jewish community for this horrendous, murderous attack. And again, that wasn't true in every circle, and we got plenty of support from a lot of our friends, from elected officials, from law enforcement. We've really seen allies stand up and be counted, but we need more to do so and show some moral clarity. Again, since the Hamas attack, anti-Semitic incidents across the country have spiked beyond levels that were already alarming, and college campuses, have seen that. Again, it's hard to expect Jews to feel secure when so many sided with Hamas terrorists. And I think that's, part of the situation. You can have empathy for the Palestinian people that are going through really tragic time, but you can also, try and understand how this was started by a terrorist organization that committed atrocities, killing babies, raping women, killing elderly and handicapped, and then retreating with hostages and holding, hundreds of hostages of Israelis as hostage in the worst circumstances, and essentially going and creating these tunnel system where they hide under schools and hospitals and mosques. So when these presidents of universities were called to testify before Congress and asked about whether calls for genocide against the Jewish people should be condemned and not allowed, and we had these very legalistic answers of it depends, or it depends on the context. I think there was just a sense of outrage that there should be moral clarity, that if any other group were threatened in that way, that the answer would be very clear and very concise. And the answer would be, we cannot allow that to happen. And that should have been the answer. I don't think it's only on these elite campuses that this is occurring. I know at my alma mater, University of Texas in Austin, the Hillel was just defaced a week ago. I know that there are incidents happening really all over the country. It's been sort of allowed to fester, but it's being addressed. I think there are people of goodwill who are standing up, and that's what it requires. And it can't just be brushed, under the rug anymore. And so I would say whether it's happening in Ivy League schools or whether it's happening in large public universities, leadership matters. And it's the reason why we work with presidents of universities and administrators who really need to be the first line of defense in saying what is not acceptable on college campus. And so we at AJC work closely with many of these universities and are trying to play a constructive role to work with our friends and allies to stand up to a lot of what we've been seeing.
I think for some people that are not really involved and, I don't want to say not highly educated about the discussion, there is a misconception that what's going on at the universities, I think some people think, oh, well, what's the problem with my 20-year-old child protesting in support of the Palestinians and marching and saying whatever they are saying? But I think it goes beyond that, those actions. And, you have the First Amendment, but, as an attorney, I always need to throw in some legalism into the discussion on my podcast. And Title VI applies and basically says that if the university is getting federal funding, they've got to protect the students from discrimination and all that. And I guess that's the crux of the matter, is they're not really doing that. Or there have been lots of instances where they have not, and they've been exposed. And there have been a lot of students who are literally terrorized and not getting protected. And it's really horrific to go through, you're 20 years old, you're trying to go to classes or whatever, and you're having to combat this, and the dean of your university says, well, I'm not going to protect you because it depends. It's just, that's traumatic.
I think, I think there's the security issue that you raise, and I think there's the sort of legal piece, and there are, ongoing lawsuits, but I think fundamentally it's also, addressing the climate on campus, that, anti-Semitism should be included when people are learning about other forms of discrimination and hate. They really need to understand what anti-Semitism is and why they need to stand up against it. I think, in some cases, people are, of course, have freedom of speech. So the question is, when does that turn into either hate speech? And then the more subtle issues of, Jewish students feeling part of included and not excluded, which in many, student organizations, having this sort of litmus test that if you're, pro-Israel, that you can't join certain organizations or you'll be ostracized. So I think there's the more formal, keeping students safe has to take priority. And then there's the next stage, which is the culture of some of these universities in terms of inclusivity of the Jewish community. And so I think in some, schools, they're doing this better than others. I do think there's been a wake-up call that this has been ignored for too long. And certainly within AJC, we are helping where we can, and working with Hillel and working with other, student organizations, Jewish organizations on campus, and working with students to really make these universities a place where students can do, as you say, Greg, learn, grow, mature, and learn how to be a part of a community. But you can't be part of a community if there's sort of exclusionary systems in place. So I think we have a lot of work to do, but I think there's a lot of allies out there who want to improve the situation.
All right, so talking about AJC, and before I even really got deep into preparing for this discussion, my initial reaction is, boy, it's really hard to change somebody who hates you from hating you. And hate has been going on forever. And like what could the AJC actually do to combat it? So on the level of education, I have gone through the website to see some of the things that you're doing, but what does AJC do in this context? So we're not just talking about the universities, but public education, independent education. What can you actually do to make a difference?
So I'll say, number one, this was something years ago that AJC identified as you can't approach, whether that's in the political establishment or within education or law enforcement, you really have to have a whole of society approach. And so we issued a call to action, which was basically a call to identify anti-Semitism, confront it when you see it, and prevent it from happening in the first place. And therefore, that call to action was answered in many ways by the White House, and they created a national strategy to combat anti-Semitism. And this really is a big deal. There's never been a more comprehensive government, White House approach to saying that this is a society-wide problem, and it therefore needs a society-wide approach. So we've worked closely in helping to implement some of the findings. And so this national strategy to combat anti-Semitism, it has over 200 recommendations. It's a 60-page report. I recommend people reading it, or at least reading the summary of it. And it essentially identifies ways that agencies within the federal government can stand up to anti-Semitism. But it also is something we have to take seriously within the corporate world, within education, within law enforcement. And so one of the things AJC is doing, we're doing trainings with leaders in these different spheres. So again, so they can understand who the Jewish community is, what is anti-Semitism, why it matters, how do we combat it. And so that's a lot of the work that we're doing now, is trying to really approach this from a systemic point of view, that we have to work with all of these different sectors, and working with our partners, in so many fields, mayors from across the country, law enforcement officials, educators. So it's we're finding a lot of receptivity. We're finding that elected officials and leaders in education and in corporations and many other fields want to work with us, even within sports teams, because we've seen that anti-Semitism can rear its ugly head in entertainment industry and so many different places. And a lot of it is based on lack of education, lack of understanding. So we're trying to get ahead of the issue and trying to work with a lot of these leaders from these different fields.
Yeah, so going on to the sports and entertainment, we've talked a little bit about what's going on campus, educational settings and all that, but apparently it's also happening in the sports and entertainment world. I reference Matisyahu. I'm not a reggae, aficionado, so apologies for butchering the name, but his shows were canceled in Chicago, the House of Blues, one of my favorite places. It's very sad to see that. Also, Serie A Soccer League had some pretty horrific events there. But let's talk about what they did over there. They seem to take action. So I don't know if I'm going to call it a success story, but there was some pretty bad conduct among some of their fans. Let's talk about what happened there, and then let's talk about what AJC can do in the sports world. I mean, you guys have, I think, actually done some training with the NBA.
Yeah, that's correct. And there are certainly a plethora of examples of anti-Semitic statements made by various recording artists and by entertainers and sports figures. And so I think each one you have to take on a case-by-case basis, but we also have engaged with some of the major professional associations within these different industries to conduct and be proactive in conducting these trainings, so that people understand, again, what is anti-Semitism, what statements cross the line, what's legitimate criticism, and then how do you combat it? How do you work with these organizations to really address it? But yeah, I think, in certain cases, in the sports context, and you mentioned some of the chants and other really awful illustrations of anti-Semitism we see in soccer and other sports. And I think you have to take a hard approach to some of these, and there have to be which some of the soccer leagues have had to do in banning certain fans or certain statements or things that they've chants that they would do, even canceling games of certain teams because it really cannot be allowed to continue. If you think about the racial epithets that are made there, it's just unacceptable. And then of course you point out entertainers, Jewish entertainers who are kind of canceled their performances because they're seen to be pro-Israel, and therefore there's threats of violence. There can't be a heckler's veto in that case. And so I think with many of these instances where we see anti-Semitism from notable figures, we have to approach it initially, give people a chance to see if this was out of ignorance or whether it was truly out of malice, and approach each one kind of individually. But we also have to collectively realize there's a problem, and a lot of it is based on ignorance. And so we're trying to address that by conducting these trainings, by developing relationships, and by really trying to be a partner in really educating and combating some of these things.
Yeah, I guess one of it's just so hard for me to believe that this is happening at sporting events. But one of the, I grew up with Pink Floyd and, Dark Side of the Moon. I was like, oh my God, that is like what I loved. And when I first started to hear about Roger Waters and his conduct, it was just really, I wouldn't say demoralizing, but, it was just sad to see how, what's become of him, I guess. And of course he denies it all, but I think his history is kind of well
Yeah,
done.
I mean, I think the facts, what he, what statements he's made, and looking at those, and understanding, again, people can have their own opinions, they can voice their own opinions, but when those opinions turn into attacks against a community, and really ad hominem attacks and go beyond what's acceptable, then he has free speech, but so do the rest of us who are deeply offended by some of those comments and statements. And I think one of the things we have to remember through all of this is to be proud in our Jewish identity, to be able to reach out to others. As you pointed out at the beginning, there's other forms of discrimination and hatred and bias. And we have to, if we want to have a friend, we have to be a friend. We have to care about what's happening in other communities in the United States. And there's a lot of other discrimination that we have to stand up and be counted. But we also have to stand up for ourselves. And we also have to set the record straight when it comes to the Jewish community. So I think finding a way to do that and be proud in our own identity and being willing to stand up, those are key right now.
All right, so we wanted to kind of make sure we touched on all the things that AJC is doing to combat anti-Semitism. So you mentioned, we talked about the campuses, and you mentioned guides that AJC has on its website, which I'll put all this in the show notes so people can get to the website and see what they can do. We'll get to that in a little bit. So you've got guides for Congress, mayors, county officials, law enforcement, educators, legislators. Basically, what do these guides do?
So thank you for mentioning them, and they are on AJC's website. And, I really do recommend people take a look, because it really is that strategy of looking at the different sectors within society where anti-Semitism has been occurring, and giving specific ideas, recommendations, and opportunities to learn about the Jewish community, to learn about anti-Semitism, how to identify it again, how to combat it, and how to prevent it from happening in the first place. And it's very much tailored to these different sectors of society. So I think, within the workplace, there's information there within education and these different fields that you mentioned. So, I think that for people who have a specific interest in one of these areas, it gives you some tips, some ideas, and some resources that can be used in order to confront, anti-Semitism, or even if it's not occurring, to be proactive and make sure that within trainings that happen within HR departments or in other contexts, that the Jewish community is included within those. So those are really great for to share with people, to share with folks in different sectors of society.
And you did mention that AJC actually, in addition to providing these resources, will help train these institutions. Let's talk about that. So let's say, I'm the principal at a public high school and I see all this going on. I have no idea what to do. Can I contact AJC and say, hey, I need your help? Or is it just I'm looking at your guide and I got to kind of take it from there?
No, absolutely, you're right. We want to be able to help those institutions that are looking to address these issues. So I think step one would be for us to get them the guide so they have a place to start and to think about. And then for sure, that's part of why we exist and what we're growing in terms of our work in combating domestic anti-Semitism. We want to be helpful. We want to be a resource to individuals. We have been conducting trainings within independent schools and some public schools, and again, working on college campuses, working within the corporate context, trying to be a resource to some of the sports leagues and other sectors of the corporate world. So, yes, we want to be a resource if we can be, and be helpful as people try to address this issue.
Yeah. And I don't want to overlook small businesses. I've seen several instances, restaurants that are getting attacked and all that. What can they do, and how can they utilize AJC to help them out?
So, again, the Small Business Administration was part of the National Strategy to Combat Anti-Semitism that came from the White House. And there are specific tools and resources available to small businesses through the SBA. AJC signed a memorandum of understanding with the SBA to, address and combat anti-Semitism because, of course, small businesses are dealing with this just like large corporations. So I would say, looking at that White House strategy to combat anti-Semitism and seeing the resources that are there, looking at some of the guides that we have on our AJC website, and then contacting us at AJC to find out how we can be further helpful is a good strategy to start.
All right. And you did mention that there's a national strategy to combat anti-Semitism at the White House. So what is it a document? Is it a committee? Is it a group? What is that?
So it was a senior, leadership level group that formed within the White House and different cabinet level leaders to find ways across the federal government on how to combat anti-Semitism. So it's a 60-page document that can be found online under the White House Strategy to Combat Anti-Semitism. And it's reading that 60-page document, which is obviously a large document, but contains all of these recommendations in these different sectors. It has about 200 recommendations on specific things that different sectors can do to combat anti-Semitism. So I definitely recommend trying to get a hold of that as a first step to understand And then, throughout AJC's 24 offices around the United States, we are helping in that implementation process, but also at a local level, because many of those recommendations are for federal agencies. We are trying at the local level, at the county level, at the city level, at a state level, to help educate and be a resource in many of the similar ways that this national strategy is laying out these resources. Many of them are applicable at a state, county, local level.
Yeah. And you also did reference a task force that is AJC's task force.
AJC formed a specific task force with leaders from throughout our offices around the country to help in that implementation process that I just mentioned, which is to help at where we can at the federal level within implementing some of these in agencies, federal agencies, but then also at a local level, how do we take some of the best practices and recommendations that are put out in this national strategy and implement them at a local level. So that task force has leaders from all over the country who are trying to find those best practices and figure out how to make sure this happens both at a national level and at a local level.
All right. And what can we do? What concerned citizens like myself, hey, listen, you don't have to be a Jew to be concerned about this, want to support this, combat anti-Semitism. What can we do?
I think, some of this will be pretty obvious to you and to others. I think speak out, when you see anti-Semitism, make sure it doesn't just go unaddressed. Work to create a safe environment, which is part of that, speaking out, but making sure that, your friends from the Jewish community feel like they have a safe environment and are supported. I think, taking action, looking on AJC's website, we have many opportunities to weigh in on specific policies. Right now there's efforts to have this national strategy and some of the recommendations adopted by Congress and in other forms. There's hate crimes legislation, which is a big piece of all of this, which is when an anti-Semitic hate crime is committed, the reporting becomes very, very important, because the way that hate crimes are tracked is only when people or law enforcement officials report them. And so there's legislation that's being proposed right now in this hate crimes arena to incentivize local law enforcement and others to report more consistently. So I think making sure you get involved, look on our AJC's website to see ways in which to do that, and learn more about these issues, because you and I, Greg, we've only scratched the surface behind, some of what is out there in terms of how to understand anti-Semitism, why it's important, how it, is both part of this landscape of combating hatred and bigotry, and how anti-Semitism it needs to be confronted in its own right.
And it's really something that you could spend your lifetime, make some progress, but it's always going to be there. That's my feeling. Thank God for people like you and the AJC, your resources, and one other thing that people can do is to donate. I definitely tell people, if you're interested, if this topic was somewhat, interesting to you, go to the website, ajc.org. There's an enormous amount of resources. My God, the whole weekend I was on it and I couldn't get through the whole thing, but I tried my best. And hopefully, Brian, did I miss anything? Is there anything you want to?
No, I think, if people, want to contact me, if they want to, find ways to engage in these issues, if they need more information, certainly available to have those conversations. I think, as you say, this is not an issue that is going away anytime soon. And I think the lessons are that, we can't ignore it, but we also have to be proud in our identity and our support for the state of Israel and our pride in being Jewish. We have to, reach out to our allies and be allies to them, and not take that for granted. And we have to educate ourselves and be proactive and be willing to speak up. So, Greg, I appreciate you giving me that opportunity to speak up, and I appreciate your interest in this topic and your leadership. So thank you.
I will say this. This has been fascinating to me. It's opened my eyes. I'm almost embarrassed at how much it's opened my eyes. Normally, my call to action at the end of my podcast is subscribe, rate, review, give me questions, what have you. But my CTA this time is get educated, get informed, speak out, take action, don't turn a blind eye. Everybody's affected, all right? And I know that people want to protest. They're not happy with what's going on in Israel. Fine, keep your protests the way protests are supposed to be, and not violent and taking, just horrific action against innocent people or whatever. That's not going to solve the problem. Maybe it'll make you feel good for a couple of minutes, but believe me, that really doesn't help what you're trying to accomplish. So that'll do it for this episode of Cut to the Chase. Brian Siegal from the American Jewish Committee, Regional Director. Thank you for coming on. And listen, maybe in 6 months we'll talk again, and hopefully there'll be some progress, breakthroughs, and we'll carry on the conversation then.
We'll work hard to make that happen. And thanks again for the opportunity, Greg. It was an honor to be with you.
All right.
That's all for this episode of Cut to the Chase. But before you go, will you open up your podcast app and give us a 5-star review? You can also leave a comment about what you liked most or other topics you'd like us to cover. And please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming shows. Thanks, everybody. Be safe out there.